All right, guys, welcome back and welcome to the very first of what is going to end up being a 5-part CFM/franchise mode wish list for Madden 20. Obviously, it's only October and Madden has only been out for a couple of months at this point, but I feel like we're starting to close in on that period where things start to transition from working on the current Madden and focus starts getting placed on what's going to be going into the next Madden. And last year, the first real videos that I created and put on this channel were my CFM wish list videos, and those were done in around February and March, and I knew even then that it was pretty late to be making those kind of videos and that they were more of a what I was hoping to see rather than hoping that they actually take those ideas and be able to implement them into Madden. So I wanted to get these videos out a little bit earlier this year and kind of get that discussion going a bit earlier than I did last year so that when Madden 20 rolls around we can get as much of the things that we want to see into Madden 20. But enough about that. Let's get right into the first topic that I'm going to be discussing, which, as you've already seen by the title, is going to be an overhaul to scouting. This wasn't something that was on my wish list last year or really even on my radar. I've never been a huge fan of how scouting has been done, but I've also felt like there's always been bigger fish to fry, and I still kind of feel that way. But since Madden 19 has dropped, I've seen a lot of talk about scouting needing to be improved or overhauled, and I think part of that is a result of custom draft classes being implemented this year. But I definitely agree with the thought that it needs to be improved, so I figured since I've seen a lot of demand around it, I take a shot at throwing some ideas on some mock-ups and get that conversation going around what people might want to see out of scouting in Madden. Now, before I get into the mechanics and the specifics of that, I'm going to say that this isn't going to be the deepest it possibly could be. I know that's what a lot of people want, and especially a lot of you guys that watch my videos, but when I do things like this, I try to do it in a way where it's balanced, but to that same extent also where things lean more to the deeper side than the shallow side. There's a lot more that can be done and a lot further that you can go with a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about, but I'm trying to present something that can do its best to appeal to both sides of the Madden player base and not just the hardcore franchise player, even though that's exactly what I am and what I'd like to see. So if it's not as deep as you'd like or as deep as you think it should be, I definitely understand and I'm right there with you. But like I said, my goal with this is to try and work that balance with these ideas. But with that, let's get into scouting, where the first major change is going to come in the form of regional scouts. Now, regional scouts would be staff for your team that you would be able to hire and fire and would have contracts just like coaches and players. And how these scouts would work is that you'd have 4 regional scouts for each region of the United States: West, Midwest, Southeast, and Northeast. And each of these scouts would be responsible for scouting players that fall within a given area. So, for example, any player at Washington or Oregon is going to be scouted by the West Scout. Any player from Florida or Alabama is going to be scouted by the Southeast Scout, and so on. And then each of these scouts is going to have a number of skills or abilities that is going to be unique to each scout. Think of those like player ratings and traits that can progress and regress as you advance further throughout your franchise. So starting with the major one, which is going to be evaluation ability or eval ability, and this is exactly as it sounds. Each scout is going to have an evaluation rating for positions on each side of the ball, and it's going to range from poor being the worst to excellent being the best, with below average, average, and good in between. And those ratings are going to determine how accurate the information you're getting from that scout is likely to be, and how that's going to end up being done I will get to shortly. But above that, you're going to see some more things, starting with the first one, which is going to be reputation, and this is basically going to act like an overall for scouts. Scouts with higher reputations will be more coveted and will garner more money as well as more contract offers from other teams, and this would also be a rating that fluctuates based on how the players that he scouted and graded end up panning out. If he grades a bunch of players high that turn out to be busts, then his reputation is going to go down. If he ends up hitting on a lot of good players, then his reputation will go up. Then we have specialty, which is also just as it sounds. It's the position group that a scout specializes in. This could range from a specific position like quarterback or edge rushers to a whole position group like defensive backs, or even an entire side of the ball in offense or defense. Now, what the specialty will actually do is something that I will also be getting into a little bit later once we take a look at the full scouting report. But moving on to another big part of scouts, which is going to be bias and influencers. And this is where things can get really interesting, because if you just have scouts that have evaluation evaluation abilities that vary for each position, that really ends up being the only thing that separates one scout from another, and it doesn't really make them or the reports that you're getting back that unique, and that's where the bias and influencers would come into play. So getting into the specifics of those, there's 4 specific ones that I base things off of for these mock-ups. Obviously there could be more, but I think these 4 pretty much cover a good amount without getting too crazy. And the first one is going to be athleticism. And scouts with this bias are going to covet and grade players higher that are considered above average athletes at their position. Conversely, players that might have good intangibles but aren't necessarily great athletes or are considered below average athletes at their position are going to be graded lower. Moving to the next one, which is going to be talent. Scouts with this bias are going to grade players more on their immediate perceived ability and won't factor in potential or dev trait as much with their grades. So when it comes down to it, they're going to be favoring the player that is better right now versus the one that might be better in 3 or 4 years. And then to the next one, which is going to be intangibles, and this is kind of the other side of athleticism to a certain extent. Scouts with this influencer are going to grade players higher that have higher intangible ratings, which are the ratings that are unique to that position. So a wide receiver that is already a good route runner with good hands is going to grade out higher than a raw receiver who might be a physical specimen. And then lastly, there's potential, which is kind of the other side of talent. With this bias, scouts will grade players with higher ceilings and perceived long-term talent better than players with limited ability. So when you look at a guy like Josh Allen, he has an absolute cannon, and coaches basically think if we can teach him this or that, then basically we have Joe Montana with a rocket arm. Same kind of thing with Michael Vick, where he has this really unique skill or ability for his position, and if he's able to develop the other parts of his game, he's going to be unlike anything you've ever seen before. And this is going to be the one where you're going to end up with a lot of that boom or bust potential. So I think that just about covers that, and the main purpose of these is, just like I mentioned, to make scouts a lot more unique rather than just having the eval ability being the be all end all and having 2 different scouts spit out a nearly identical grade on a player and a nearly identical report on a player. There's going to be more factors going into it, which makes the process and decision making a bit more interesting and thoughtful, in my opinion. But now that we've covered that part of things, it's time to get into the actual evaluation process. So I'm going to start with the prospect board here, and this should look and feel pretty familiar. But starting in the top left, you're going to see the available scouting points being replaced by the prospects remaining. So basically, the process of scouting would work exactly the same as it currently does, but instead of being allotted scouting points, each scout is going to have a number of players that he will be assigned to scout for that week. So like I said, the process is more or less going to be the same. The medium is just going to be a little bit different. But then below that, you're going to see some new quality of life additions with an added tab that shows you the draft depth, deepest position, weakest position, and projected number 1 pick. This is going to be universal information that would be the same for the entire league and is meant to just give you a quick overview of what to expect out of that draft class rather than always pretty much going in blind. And then to the prospect board, which like I said should look and feel familiar, but you're going to notice that I have changed how the projections work. Instead of having 32 prospects slotted for the first round, 32 prospects slotted for the second round, and so on, prospects are going to be given a more universal projection based on their scout grade. So what that means is that in a really deep or a top heavy draft, you could end up actually potentially having 8 top 5 projections, or maybe even 45 first round projections, and so on. And then finally on the right, you'll see that the letter grades are gone and are replaced with the scout that is assigned to that player if you choose to scout them for that week, as well as a progression bar for their scouting report, which brings us to the prospect scouting report. So as you can see here, Mike Wand has 10% of his scouting report completed, and basically that's where every player would start, and this is essentially the type of scouting report that you'd be starting with for every single player. You're going to get either 1 or 2 statements for a scouting report to start with, and this is also where that specialty trait that I mentioned is going to come into play for the scouts. If quarterback or offense was this scout's specialty, then you'd for sure start with at least 2 and would have the possibility of starting with 3 of those statements comments for the scouting report as well. And I know fog of war is something that gets mentioned a lot when it comes to scouting, and I am definitely a big fan of it, but when it comes down to not knowing absolutely anything about a player because you didn't scout him, I don't really agree with that approach. I think at the very least you should be given a small amount of information and the ability to build on that information, and you should never be in a position where you're just picking a player completely blind. You might disagree with me on that, which is completely fine, but this is the approach that I've decided to go with. But moving back to the scouting report, when you choose to scout a player each week, you're going to get 1 or 2 of those scouting report tidbits added to his report, and this is where again the scout specialty and eval ability will come into play. So similar to the initial report, a scout specialty is going to help you scout those players faster. So a scout with wide receiver as his specialty is going to get 2 or 3 each time he scouts a receiver versus 1 or 2 for other positions. And keep in mind though that while he scouts those players faster, his eval ability will still dictate how likely that information actually is to being accurate. And since I'm showing you a quarterback, I decided to use deep accuracy to show you exactly how eval ability would essentially work. So here you have an example of 15 statements all relating to the deep accuracy attribute, and just for the sake of the example, there is going to be 3 that fall into each level of ability for that attribute: elite, good, average, below average, and bad. Now, based on the prospect's actual rating, one of those statements would be chosen as the quote perfect evaluation. And once again, for the sake of the example, we're just going to choose this one, which reads, has a pretty deep ball the NFL defenses will have to respect or he will make them pay. So based on that, and then your scout's eval ability will be what determines what kind of statement you end up receiving on the scouting report. So if your scout has excellent eval ability, you're going to get a statement very close within the range and even possibly that perfect evaluation statement. But as your scout's eval ability starts to get lower, the range of possible statements you can receive and potential for a poor evaluation will increase. So in this example, you can see once we go from excellent to good, we now have 2 descriptions falling under both the good and the average category. And as we move along, that gap continues to widen to the point where a poor evaluator can either tell you he's amazing or basically supremely average. But with that, it doesn't mean that that poor evaluation will always be poor. It just means that there's a higher likelihood of it being poor. But even with the poor scout, there's still a chance he could give you that perfect evaluation of something. And that's the real fog of war element that I'm trying to convey here. Even with the best scout, there's still some layers of mystery behind the evaluation. And based on what kind of scouts you have, you're put in a position to make choices and almost make gambles based on that information that you're given. And I think that's what would make a system like this feel much more in depth and a much more interesting process than what is currently in place. So now back to the scouting report. As I mentioned before, each week you scout a player, you're going to get a little bit more information about him until you either stop scouting him or he becomes fully scouted. And by the time a player ends up being fully scouted, you should have a comment on just about every possible intangible attribute for his position. So a fully scouted player will truly feel like a fully scouted player. But moving to the right of the scouting report, you're going to see some more information in the form of the player profile, where you're going to find things like a player grade. And this is basically a universal scale for how good a prospect is perceived to be. Then there's also the overall projection that coincides with that player grade. Below that, you have a player comparison, which is going to compare a prospect's skill set to a current or previous NFL player to just give you an idea or hint of what kind of player they are or might become. Moving below that, you have a couple of things that are not only aids for the user, but also some potential scouting hints at overall and dev trait with the short-term and long-term projection. Same kind of thing under that with the current roster fit. And then one last aid and evaluation tool with a prospect's projected ceiling and projected floor on where he might be drafted. And with all of these things, they're going to also be based on your scout's bias or influencers as well as his eval ability. So none of it is intended to be 100% certain. And then with everything on the right side as well, I think it would be better if it was all adaptive and would update as you scouted a player more. You could have it be static, but I think having it change over the course of the season and over the course of the scouting that you do on a certain player, it would make things more interesting as well as more engaging. One of the bigger issues I have with the current system is that you scout a guy in week 3 and there's really not much reason to go back and look at him again until the draft. But then moving to the right, we go to the physical tab where scouts take a back seat and more certainty enters the picture. So starting on the left side, we have the Spark score. If you don't know what it is, it's essentially an attempt to quantify athleticism into a universal rating. So think of it kind of like the physical rating that's been used in Madden before, but basically this would attempt to give you a hint at the type of athlete a player was before the combine. Another big frustration I have with the current system is that you have no idea what kind of athlete a player is until the combine. If I only want a speed burner wide receiver or want to avoid slow corners or slow linebackers, I want to be able to do those kind of things, and you shouldn't be forced to wait until the off season to find things like that out. So you get some hints at a player's athletic ability and a projected score that shows you how he potentially stacks up athletically versus players on your roster as well as across the league. Then once you hit the combine, that projected Spark score is going to turn into a definite one based on his combine data. And then lastly, I also threw in pro days with the idea there being players that either aren't invited to the combine or decide to not participate in one or the other or both, with the reasoning being that two sets of data can either confirm what a player might be for you, or it might also raise more questions and thinking if there is a discrepancy between his sets of data. And then to the same extent, a player that has only one set of data also leaves a bit of mystery as to whether the data is just a one-off or is truly accurate. So more of that fog of war type element there. And then the last tab there is just more of a quality of life type thing, where any stories and tweets related to that player are going to be kept within his scouting report. The news feed is not in a good place. It's buried, and if you're not looking at it every single week, you're more than likely going to miss some stories or tweets. So keeping them in a place easily accessible if you miss them or just don't pay attention to the news feed at all, I think would be helpful in my opinion. So that's why I added that there. But that covers just about everything I have. One last thing I wanted to mention with this is that I 100% do not want this to be a replacement for the current system. I want users to have options, and I understand what I laid out here isn't going to be for everyone. And if that's the case, I don't want to force it on people and push them away from franchise mode because it's too complicated or too time consuming. So the way I look at this is as more of an expanded option, while the current system would fall more under a simple system, and there should be options for both. But hopefully this video wasn't too long and I was able to convey all the points and mechanics I presented in an easy to understand way. But let me know what you guys think of what I outlined here. Do you like it, dislike it? What else do you want to see scouting look like and cover in Madden? Leave it all in the comments, and hopefully when Madden 20 comes around, scouting will see some significant upgrades. I hope you guys enjoyed the mock-ups and this video on scouting. I'm going to have more Wishlist and Chiefs franchise videos coming soon, so stay tuned. As always, I appreciate you guys tuning in to listen to me talk about Madden, and until next time, thanks for watching.